Finding the right balance of email marketing for dealerships can be tricky. For sure, promotional emails can be a great way to bring new buyers in, both to the service bay and for new car. Too many emails can be extremely overwhelming and, frankly, for the user, downright frustrating. So how much is too much? How much should you be using? And what should you be doing with this email? Even thinking about who you should be talking to. There's a lot of questions to be answered. Hi there, my name's Ian Cruikshank. I'm the CEO of Leadbox. Looking forward to spending time with you at my desk, getting into the details of email marketing. Let's jump in and take a look. So why email marketing for your dealership anyway? We're going to take a deep dive into all of the information that's available for you to better understand all the parts that you need to be thinking about when you're running an email campaign, or even why you would run an email campaign in the first place. For starters, it's hugely cost effective, right? When you can consider the delivery of an email is virtually free, all you have to have done before is build up your email database. And tell me, when was the last time you looked in your CRM and you saw a number that was over 10,000? Probably over 20,000, maybe more. Depending on your retail location, you probably have a huge amount of emails in your database. Rural or metro retailers, you've definitely got a lot of people that you can communicate with regularly. On the targeting side of things, segmenting your audience is a really important part of the puzzle as well. You can understand from your CRM their history, where they're located, the vehicles that they've got in their garage, or potentially that they've purchased from you in the past if they're not a current driver of one of your cars. Right? We can get into departmental use. We can talk about the sales side of things, but also service and parts. Even financing and insurance can get into detailed communications that you may want to send to your potential customers. Right? There's lots to be considering. There's also the importance of being able to track the communication that you're having with these folks. Consider when we're working in digital marketing, you've got lots of ways to be able to track things. When you're getting into something that's as granular as email, you can see the individual who's actually looking at that email. You can get the details on what that consumer clicked on, so you can know even better what it is that they're interested in. Right? Beyond that, you can get into automation. You can set up plans, you can set up systems within your email tools to be able to send out communications on a regular basis that you don't even have to consider the details of. They can be pre-planned initiatives that go out when certain milestones are met within your CRM or your email marketing platform. There are lots of factors that are going to affect the success of your email campaigns. Right? Let's look at a few. First off, it's going to be the content relevance, right? How relevant is that content that you're sending out to a potential reader to them, right? Are they looking for something at the moment that you're answering a question about? Are they interested in taking care of something that you're offering? Or are they even interested in the vehicles that you've got at all, right? These are things that we can figure out. There's telltale signs to figure out how to align the content that we're sending with the people that we're sending that communication to. For example, you don't want to get into this space where you're sending someone who's buying trucks on the regular and sending them a convertible, right? We want to get a little more consistent with what it is that we're communicating with people on. Timing is particularly important as well, right? Sending an email at the right time is an important piece of the puzzle. And of course, that can be relative to time of day or day of the week or anything like that. But even just something as simple as sending an email in the right season, right? We're not talking tire changes in the middle of winter. We're talking tire changes before winter begins, right? So too with oil changes and that sort of thing, we can time those relative to what's happening with our customers in the service area. Get the timing right, you're going to get better response. All right, content density, right? How much are you going to actually communicate to people? Have you ever heard the term TLDR? Too long, didn't read? Yeah, that can happen a lot with your emails. You want to be concise. You want to be clear about the message you're trying to communicate. Sometimes visuals are beneficial. Sometimes you just want to stick to straight text. but let's not say too much in that space. Really, we're trying to promote action, right? Let's just make the point and give someone who's interested the chance to click through to see more information elsewhere. And if we're putting in a variety of different pieces of content, we can even set it up where we just have the first little bit of each piece of content, the next little bit of the next piece of content, and so on down the line with a simple link to more content available on your website, right? So we can really break it down so that the person who's receiving that email can really choose their own adventure and decide what they want to get out of that communication. Long form, giant multiple paragraph statements are going to fall into that TLDR category. So like in any marketing communication environment, we can get a little repetitive. And in email, it becomes all the more important because we're having a personal one-to-one communication with our prospective customers. So if we're saying the same thing over and over again at the same time, what are we going to do? We're going to dull the potential of that message. We're going to make it so that consumer no longer is even listening to what we're talking about. So let's make sure that we're breaking it down. Maybe if you're going in a series of 3 emails, you can talk about the special announcement with the highlights, right? Those sorts of information up front. Maybe share a success story, a testimonial, a little bit more information to break it down. The third, then maybe you go for that bonus offer or that special incentive, right? Building the story as you go to help someone get closer and closer to converting on the goal that you're trying to achieve. All right, so we talk about how much is too much. For starters, I really got to put it out there that there's probably not enough happening yet, right? The reality is most of our dealer partners that we work with, when we ask them the question about email marketing, they say, oh yeah, our service department sends things out every now and then, like when people schedule an appointment or something. A friend of mine recently was at a conference, he was speaking at the event, and he asked the whole community, the whole audience that he was speaking with, how many folks are doing email marketing? And there were about 2 people that put up their hands. The reality is, too much is a bad thing, but we really should get started. This is an important piece of the puzzle, and this is really the space where you get to flex your strength of all of the great relationships that you've built in the past. Let's not forget about that first-party data that's so valuable for you to be able to communicate with your constituents on. So, email fatigue, there's a few key metrics that you're going to want to pay attention to. One of the first ones, of course, is open rate. Are people actually opening the communication that you're sending out, right? So when I think of a typical benchmark open rate, and we'll get into benchmarking in a second, I've got some reservations about benchmarks, but 20 to 25% open rate, that's pretty darn good, right? For a marketing communication email. When we talk about click rate, right? So people actually opening an email and then clicking to go somewhere else, probably to your website to explore something, right? Maybe 2 to 4% can be in that benchmarking range. I often talk about 4, but really 2 to 4 is probably fair. The click-through rate is just simply dividing those pieces through, right? The unsubscribe rate, that's one where you're thinking, okay, how many people got communication from you and said, piss off, I don't want to hear from you again, right? Not an ideal thing, not an ideal scenario, but unsubscribe, particularly in Canadian digital communications law and CASL compliance, is a very important thing to keep in mind. So don't mess around with those unsubscribes. Leave them unsubscribed or you can get yourself into some hot water. In fact, if you really want to get down to it, if you're consistently over 1% in most email marketing platforms, you're going to get yourself into hot water right away. That's a great sign to say you're not sending things to the right people, the people who signed up for your communications, right? That's really who we're talking about communicating with, people who have opted in for communication with your business. So when I talk about benchmarking, it's a really important thing to consider, and this is consistent when we're talking about digital advertising metrics as well. So when we're talking about performance, cost per lead, all of those great things that happen relative to the work that you're doing in digital advertising or relative to the work that you're doing on beautiful lead box websites, right? In those sorts of situations, when we're talking benchmarking, it is most important to understand what your benchmark is. What's your own starting point for your business? There's no other business exactly like yours in the market. let's be clear. The exact same brand, the exact same location, the exact same town, with the exact same interests. No, it really doesn't happen that often. And so often, and it drives me a little bit batty, people get hung up on benchmarks that they feel they should achieve. And they're looking at all the dealers across the country, right? And you may be in a rural market, or you might be in a major metro. You might be a luxury store, or you might be a store that is non-luxury brand, right? You might be a new brand into the market. All sorts of possibilities that are going to affect those benchmarks. So what do? You pay attention to all the information, and you start down this path. Let's call it 90 days. You start down this path of email marketing, segmenting your audiences, which we'll talk about in a sec, figuring out the messaging that you want to get out to your potential buyers or your potential service guests. You know, going through all those pieces, and you want to send about 12 emails over that 90-day period as a minimum to be able to assess what your norms are. Keep in mind, you're going to see the first email get a lot more response than the second. Potentially a lot more response than the third, right? Things are going to taper off because that initial communication is one of a curiosity response. We want to know with our consumers that we've got some form of consistent response, some sort of consistent communication that they are feeling good about, right? But the reality is when you break down your audience and you think, okay, I'm going to send a service reminder to all of my customers a year after they purchase their vehicle, right? That means they're going to get that one type of email one time in a 12-month period. Right? So they're not going to get tired of that communication. It's really when we're talking about regular communications to a larger group or regular communications to that subset that's going to start to get you into some hot water relative to email fatigue. Once you start to figure out what your benchmarks are, once you start to figure out what your norms are, then we're going to need to pay more attention to the data. And sadly, you might need to use a little math. Fortunately, there's all sorts of online calculators out there, and frankly, you can probably even take some of that data, some of that information, and put it into ChatGPT and ask for some analysis. It's one of these beautiful things that I've been doing of late where I can take sets of numbers and ask specific questions. The analytical skills within that environment are outstanding. Do pay attention to the little hallucinations that can happen along the way, just as a little caveat there. We'll talk about that in another video. Now, the open rates and all of those sorts of things, they have standards, and we'll figure out what those baseline numbers are when we talk about those 12 emails and we start to look at that. And we can calculate what the norms are, and then we can start to figure out what normal deviations from those norms are. So we get our midpoint, and maybe that's 25%. And then if we're looking at a standard deviation that is in a normal range, we may see a range of plus or minus 4%. What does that actually mean? So if we're seeing a range at 25% and we put in our standard deviation, we're simply taking that number, subtracting the 4% or adding the 4%, right? That could fall within that standard range that is acceptable, right? When we start to go wider than this 4% or even, depending on your statistics, you're going to see some different variations along the way. So important things to figure out is what are your numbers, and then how can you best keep track of your numbers. Don't hesitate to look for online tracking capabilities or online calculators to be able to put that information in and do those searches. I often say, let me Google that for you when we get certain questions that are simply answered by punching in the numbers, checking out a YouTube video like this, and figuring out how exactly you're going to better understand what's going on with your digits, right? We'll get into some more details another time, but for now, I think that pretty well covers it. All right, so as you're looking at these benchmarks, if you're finding that you would like to improve them, and here's a pro tip, no matter what they are, you can improve them, right? That's the fun thing about figuring out what your base level benchmarks are, and then you build on those, right? It's really all about test, measure, build, right? Or test, measure, adjust, and grow. Right? That kind of idea of going piece by piece. So what are you going to do? You're sitting there, you're working on your stuff, you're trying to figure out, okay, how do I make these work better? First things first, what are you doing right now to segment your audience, right? When you're sitting there mashing the keys and you're working through your CRM, What are you doing to cut that CRM into different groups of people who are looking for different things, right? So with those messages, with those segments, those different groups of people, those different audiences effectively, you want to be communicating different things, right? So you maybe have folks that have only bought pre-owned from you in past. The likelihood, the statistical reality is that they're likely going to buy a pre-owned from you again, right? If they do that on a consistent basis. If they're always servicing their vehicle with you all the way through, they're likely going to service with you again. So if you're talking about someone relative to service, right? So being able to make sure that those bits of communications are beneficial for that consumer, right? So you get your segment and then you figure out, okay, what's the best way that I can communicate to that individual and share the information with them effectively? What's going to hit home, if you will? Then you've got like design changes. So think like you're, again, working through and you're trying to find the exactly right image, the exactly right picture to go with this campaign, and you're gonna get so dialed, it's gonna look perfect. Well, consider for a second the last time you got an email from an organization that was marketing to you, and that email looked like a piece of marketing collateral. That email looked like a marketing campaign. Was your response to that email as great as maybe another email that you received that was a text-based email? No images. Maybe there was a link embedded in there. Maybe there was a couple things that you could do from that email, but it was just a simple text-based email. So I get when you're trying to make really pretty things happen within that email environment, but consumers are used to receiving plain text emails. So you're looking at your benchmarks, you've got your template, you've got your kick-ass high-res version, right? And then you've got the same thing in a text format. Try testing, A/B test, right? So you've got 100 people in your list. You probably have a lot more, of course, but say you've got 100 people in your list, 50 get version 1, 50 get version 2, and let's see what it looks like. I think you might be surprised by that text-based email. On the other side of things, we're talking subject line, right? The actual content that's going into that, never mind how it looks. The subject line ends up being a really important piece of the puzzle. Again, thinking back to your own activities, when you're cruising through your emails, how often are you making a quick decision relative to the want to open that particular email based on the subject alone? Don't read a book by its cover, they always say, right? Well, the reality is, we're all making split-second decisions, particularly those busy folks that we're trying to communicate with, right? So when we're talking about those offers, we'll make sure that we communicate that we've got an offer, right? That's a worthwhile thing that someone might be interested in, particularly if it's the right timing. Their lease is coming up and you've got an offer on a new one, right? Or if we're talking about service, okay, maybe we can actually give them something. Maybe we can buy their interest. How would we do that? Well, maybe we've got a service offer that's like $75 off their next service visit, right? Different ways to communicate that particular interest. But if we take the time to make sure that that subject line is effective, we're going to get some additional value. That's another opening for A/B testing, by the way. You can try different subject lines in different areas, right? Split that group, test it again. Sometimes people will go that distance of saying, okay, I've got 2,000 emails that I'm going to send out. I'm going to send out 3 sets of 100 with 3 different subject lines, and then the best opened subject line is the one that I'm going to use on the bulk of my email communications. Not a bad idea, right? The next piece that you want to consider is one that we use on the regular in our world, and that's sending it from an actual human being, right? Sending that email from a human being versus a sales at or a service at your dealership name, right? So service at iancruikshankdealership.com is not going to get the same response as Ian at iancruikshankdealership.com, right? Super important to keep that in mind. One of the cool things that I find is when we send communications out, and I did one just recently, send out communications, it is a formulaic kind of communication. There's an unsubscribe button at the bottom, that sort of thing, but I'm addressing people by name. It's coming from me, and I get nice replies back, right? Appreciating the communication, appreciating the introduction to a new product, whatever it is. But those consumers are receiving that letter and perceiving it as something sent directly to them. Frankly, in most cases it is, right? But we're sending it directly to a subset of people within our audience. We want to make sure that they get that quality message, right? But it's coming from an individual. Real benefit. So the reality of things is email is a great way to communicate with your potential car buyers, your potential service guests, your potential parts folks, and all sorts of other parts of your business. Right? So you want to make sure to get into this environment. Yes, there's the potential for fatigue. As I said partway through, the reality is you're probably not sending too many at this point in time. But let's build up and see what we can get to. Right? When we start to see a lot of communications going out, we can see things start to falter. Right? So as a bit of a recap, some things as far as a sign of fatigue, we can see those metrics start to change. Right? When we see those metrics after taking the time to figure out what our proper benchmarks are, we can start to see issues relative to the communication if we're sending too many emails. Right? You'll note that I didn't tell you a number. I didn't tell you how many is too many. Reason being, you got to get started, you got to get into it. Over time, you may see that those metrics start to decrease. That's how you're going to know there's too many, right? Because the reality is, just like I said before, benchmarking is going to be different in every market, right? If you're segmenting properly, you're probably not going to get to that fatigue environment. If you're sending to everybody all the time, trust me, it's going to get problematic, but I don't think you need to worry about that just yet. So, how can you improve on that fatigue? We talked about segmenting the audience more effectively, right? We talk about design, making sure the design is effective, and even thinking about text-based communication, just the text, skip the pretty pictures. We talk about using a good subject line and having it come from an individual within your team, right? If it's sales, maybe it's your GSM. If it's service, maybe it's your service director. Whatever the case, figuring out those ways to make sure that you're communicating one-to-one with your customers, right? So, we covered a whole lot. I look forward to hearing from you. I look forward to seeing comments. You can put those down below. I encourage you to, if you like this video, please go ahead and click like and go ahead and subscribe. There'll be lots more content coming down the line. Again, my name is Ian Cruikshank. I'm the CEO of Leadbox. It's been a pleasure sharing these ideas with you today, and I look forward to the next time you come back to my desk.